Right, good morning all and welcome to another webinar brought to you by Marta. Today we'll be discussing optimizing of defenses, the third in our series, and today we'll be discussing email compromises and threats. And I'm very happy to have with me today Gary and Jared. I'll introduce you to them. I am Richard Frost, the head of product at Marta Cybersecurity, and I'll be adjudicating today's session. Gary is joining us from Mimecast as one of the business development specialists, and Jared is a technical pre-sales engineer. And gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Before we start, absolute pleasure. So before we start, I just want you to go through a few slides in the presentation format. As you may be aware, the Mimecast team produces a State of Email Security report annually. And in the 2003 report, we again contributed. You'll see there's a little quote by myself: risk mitigation and cyber insurance should go hand in hand and be a priority for businesses. And that's something that we're working on quite tightly. You'll hear more about that this year with some important announcements that we'll be making. But I think what's also quite interesting was, the statistics around 60% of companies said their cybersecurity budget is less than it should be. And I think, I actually posted something on LinkedIn the other day where I think it was Sec DevOps. The guys are saying, you've got your features, you've got your security, you've got your budget, and there's 3 sliders. And as soon as you choose the third one of them jumps off. And I think budget is normally the one that's, is always the constraint, choosing between cybersecurity or development, right? And I think one of the other things that was highlighted in the State of Email Security was also the use of AI and machine learning, and I think we'll discuss that a little bit today. But moving on to the next slide, one of the key aspects and why people look at email security is to try and avoid a data breach. And a data breach, for people that might not understand, is where a threat actor can gain access to your data. They can make a copy of it or actually steal your data and either use it for further reasons to create further breaches, or else to sell the data to a third party. Okay. An example of using that information would be, for example, with National Irish Health, where they stole patient data and they're now starting to invoice those clients legitimate amounts, but they're paying threat actors instead of the actual medical facilities. So that's how your data breaches could actually impact your business. Something else, just to understand the need for email security, there's about 33 billion electronic records that are expected to be stolen during the year 2023. The cost of breaches is around 8 trillion. Now, I think if you look at some of the statistics from 2017, on 2 customers alone with the NotPetya breach, there was a cost just on those of $4 billion. So you can understand the cost of having a breach these days. I think the average in South Africa for an SMB is about 5 million rand, going up to about 35 million on average for your middle enterprise customers. Globally, the average cost of a breach is about $4.3 million. So you can see how that equates rand-wise versus dollars. It's pretty similar. The rise of ransomware in 2022, around 13%, is getting more and more every year. And I think more and more people are becoming aware of ransomware. I've seen people that are at home being hit with a ransomware and understanding, why am I being hit? I don't have any money, right? But it's not exactly that ransomware chooses its victims. It's a widespread attack. There are specifically target campaigns where we do target through a spear phishing campaign, an organization, but a lot of the times it's literally a spray and pray type of tactic. So we need to be more aware of ransomware because it can impact more and more people than it used to in the past. On average, it takes around 212 days to detect a breach and another 75 days to contain it. Now, why is this relevant? Some breaches that are stealing your data are actually working their way around your organization. And that could take 180, 300 days before it's gathered all the information that it can steal, moved it off site, and only then are you aware of the breach through them encrypting your machines for a further ransom extortion. So this is a relevant point around active threat hunting and looking for this threat that's lying, lurking, stealing your data in your organization, right? And if we move on again, the big ticket threats at the moment, the terrible trio, is your phishing, spoofing, and ransomware, right? If you look at some of the statistics that are out there, email is one of the biggest attack vectors for launching a ransomware attack through phishing campaigns. Additionally, spoofing with sending invoices to customers acting as if they are you, all right, is another method of extorting money out of you. But also ransomware being launched, it's normally delivered via an email, but it could also be a USB, or it could be a general infection from plugging into a network, right? But those are the three vectors that most of us are seeing. Addition to that would be things like your DDoS attacks, which is also on a rise. But I think in general, it's the phishing, the spoofing, and the ransomware are the key considerations for every organization. If you look at risk mitigation and insurance, we always talk about things like zero-day attacks, that no email security solution is 100% foolproof. As much as we do sort of protect the environment and we do a lot of risk mitigation, there's always that 1% chance of being able to get through and actually infect an organization. I think this is why cyber insurance is also quite a key factor within your cybersecurity stance. It's that safety net that when things do go through, you have a way of assisting and remediating. Things like incident response teams are covered by your cyber insurance. The ability to roll out of whatever attack it is and make sure it doesn't happen again is also probably in your plan, depending on what you've got, right? But what we have seen is the more you actually protect your environment, the less chances there are of requiring that insurance. But it is still an absolute critical requirement, just in case of that one inevitability, that one attack that does slip through. Reducing risk mitigation through cyber awareness. Now, we always talk about the concept of the human firewall. And if you think about how ransomware gets in, and I'll go through a ransomware slide just now, it's normally a user that went and opened an attachment or clicked on the link and downloaded the ransomware. So the understanding of cyber awareness is making sure that users understand how they could pose a risk to the organization by clicking that link, by not creating a strong password policy or password every time you change it. A simple one I see on the list here, the oversharing of info in social media. I saw a video the other day of a lady being followed by a boyfriend and posting stuff on social media, and how a threat actor uses all the information from about 10 different videos to actually construct a phishing attack on her. And it's simple things like, today's my birthday, so now you know her date of birth. And then there's another video showing in 2017 she turned 21. And all that information, I was building a profile about you. So the oversharing is an aspect of cyber awareness that we should be cognizant of. The need for email security, and let's talk about the different focus areas and how we are actually attacked and where we should be protecting ourselves. If you look at email usage, right, it's continuing to rise. A lot of people have started using vectors like Teams to move messages around within the organization, but externally people are still using email, right? 68% have experienced an increase in email-based threats, and this could be anything from increases in spam, from increased phishing mails that are coming through with threats buried in the mail. But we've also seen that internal email attacks have increased, where one user in the organization opens up a mail, is infected, and then populates that through into the organization. And that threat could have been brought in by opening up, let's say, a personal email account and then propagating it out into the organization through your business account. Okay. We've seen also that 365 account hijacking has been on the rise as well. So I can take control of someone's email account and I can use that to then go and send emails as that individual. And if they're in a protected domain, I could infect that entire area. Okay. Cyber attacks, 2 in 3 say cyber attacks have grown increasingly sophisticated. And I think with AI again, people are using ChatGPT to actually write scripts to attack organizations or to create phishing mails. So the AI component, you almost need AI to fight against AI in these types of scenarios. 52% were harmed by a ransomware attack, and I think that's quite a scary statistics. 52% of people claim that they were actually harmed by a ransomware attack, and most people say, oh, it won't happen to me. 92% have been targeted by an email-based phishing attack. It's quite an interesting statistic as well. So it's like every single person out there has seen some form of phishing attack in their lives. I think, again, if we move across to the cyber awareness side, we have noted even with organizations becoming more cyber aware, they don't have a proper structure in place to train their staff. A lot of the campaigns are water cooler based. There's a poster up on a wall, and with COVID and people moving home, more digital type platforms to actually train the users and make them more aware from home. 8 out of 10 believe that their company is at risk due to inadvertent data leaks by careless or negligent employees. And I think the statistics that we've seen in the email security platform speak to that. We've seen users where they've clicked 135 times on a link and 2 of them have been bad. It just takes one of those bad clicks to be a legitimate ransomware, and you've now infected the organization. I don't think enough people are actually monitoring their environment. So even though they have some of the security suites in place, they're not actually monitoring those solutions. And we used the example the other day where, you have the sudden increase in spam mail, someone's actively attacking your organization. Your tools are doing the job. They are protecting you, but it means that somebody is now trying to get in, and we should probably be more proactive in how we block that and try and find out who's actually attacking our organization. Collaboration tools, I think, we talk about the integrations between certain tools like email security and endpoint security, as well as some of the monitoring tools in your SOC from a SIEM and a SOAR perspective, but also looking at the collaboration tools in Teams within 365 and within Google that are becoming more and more exposed to these types of attacks. Your budgets, again, 72% spend on average 13.5% more on cybersecurity. All right. What is interesting is how the trend is changing. If you speak to customers from 10 years ago where cybersecurity wasn't actually a part of their budget, it's now becoming a consideration. But I think it's also not enough. I don't think we're focusing enough of our budget into cybersecurity. I think if you start looking at things like DevOps or DevSecOps, sorry, your security team should be advising your developers where they should be looking at securing the environment. But at the same time, we also need to be cognizant that the developers have to get their code releases out on time. So it's almost advising what's enough security without it being prohibitive, but making sure that there is some form of security in your application, getting that right balance. So let's chat about the ransomware slide and how it comes in. I think this is quite an important one because from a ransomware perspective, there's a mechanism of delivery. And right now, we've mentioned the fact that about 95% of ransomware is delivered via an email. There's an installation component, and this is where the ransomware installs itself on a machine. It will then contact a command and control server at the headquarters. It will do a handshake and key exchange, and it will use that key to go and encrypt your machine. Once your machines are encrypted, it will then send out an extortion mail demanding Bitcoin to release encryption keys to unencrypt your machines. So how do we help organizations? Number one is email security. And this is quite key because we've mentioned that ransomware is delivered via an email. So we want to try and stop the ransomware from getting in. If it does manage to get through, because like we said, there is that 1% chance of, some form of zero-day attack getting through your email security solution. We expect the users to be able to pick up that there is a potential phishing attack and not click on any links or attachments and rather report it to IT. So this is where your user awareness training is quite critical. After that, your endpoint security will stop the actual installation of the software. And if it is installed, hopefully, if you're using something like a next generation EDR, endpoint and detect product, you'll actually be able to mitigate that ransomware. Your network security is still critical in blocking the communications between your ransomware and the command and control server, which ultimately will stop it from then being able to encrypt your machine. And again, if you look at continuity, your archiving, backups, all of that kind of stuff to be able to recover from a ransomware, that's also critical. Whoops. And you also need to make sure that your backups aren't actually backing up the ransomware, right? So from an email perspective, if you're using the right archiving solution, you can actually stop the ransomware from infecting your archive as well. And then lastly, your incident response. And again, this is hand in hand with your cyber insurance. That's a component that you'll probably require to help you to restore from ransomware if you are infected. And I think what's quite critical here is to understand that the further your ransomware gets from left to right, the more expensive it becomes to actually resolve the issues. Okay. So I'm going to open it up to the panel discussion, and I'm going to stop presenting for a while so we can start talking. And I think the first question I'm going to do is I'm going to just ask Gary. Gary, could you maybe just explain? We've looked at the state of email security report from Mimecast. Mimecast is obviously a very strong vendor in the email security space, and this is one of the reasons why we're chatting to you guys today. But could you maybe just explain a little bit about what it is that email security offers to an organization?
All right, thank you. Thank you for this. Just out of context, the report that you've actually gone over, that was a survey across 1,000 respondents in over 7 countries as well. And these 1,000 respondents consisted of CIOs, CTOs, what do you call it, security specialists as well. And that was the context that we were getting from that. And clearly the consensus is there is a risk factor that, and obviously organizations are being affected by it as well. So they're trying to look for measures and countermeasures to actually protect the organizations, their customers, and also their enterprises as well. So it's like a cycle of elements that they need to protect. And so from an email security, because email is predominantly the most overutilized communication tool, from receiving confirmation from organizations that we deal with, from customers or prospects as well, getting notifications, getting any form of trigger or any form of warning. That's generally going to be delivered from an email perspective as well. Going back to the other slide that you brought up earlier on, there's an increase in email usage as well. And for the fact there's a whole bunch of, call it, cloud platforms that we're starting to manipulate from an Amazon perspective, from a Microsoft perspective, from a G Suite perspective. And there's a lot of, call it, new players coming into the space as well from a collaboration perspective, ones that we don't know of as well, over and above the predominant ones that we coming across as well. And it's pretty adamant to see that email is still becoming, well, it is a vector that's being manipulated as much to gain access into organizations, to gain access. When I say organizations, it's not necessarily the organizations that are subscribers, but these are organizations that we would deem them as hyperscalers, the Microsofts of the world, G Suites of the world as well. So there's an element of no one is actually being targeted here. You actually spoke to that point. No one is actually a direct, call it, contact or target in this case. It's always a measure of a stepping stone of using one element or one entity to get to another entity as well, or gaining access to the most least protected organization to gain access to a bigger fish, if you want to call it that as well. And being a bigger fish or a smaller fish doesn't necessarily mean that from a monetary perspective, you're less of a target. Doesn't necessarily mean that. There could be information that they want to obtain, and information is actually quite vital. It's key. It's critical. That's where the, what do you call it, the commodity actually lies nowadays as well, gaining access to customer information as well. So from an email perspective, we see it as a principle or an element that needs to be protected, which encompasses a whole bunch of practices that overlay this element that we call email security. We've been doing this for, since 2003 or past 20 years, where we've been protecting organizations from, call it, spam attacks, advanced phishing attacks as well, impersonation attacks as well. But it doesn't only involve protecting an organization at, call it, at a filtration level. It actually involves a whole bunch of aspects, engaging with the employees, engaging with the end users, engaging with the individuals that, call it, use this platform as well. And there's a whole psychological element as well that we take into factor as well, understanding why there's specific behavioral patterns. The organizations that I've actually helped adopt and use Mimecast to increase their return on investment, the biggest thing that we spoke about was the ABCs, increasing awareness, changing the behavior, and then also changing the culture ultimately. And all of this is using one element. Obviously, from an email perspective, the most traffic that you will probably see coming into your organization, apart from someone walking through your door, is actually through an email. That's where a lot of the data that you actually see as to what is coming into organization. How do you guys interact? From a marketing perspective, marketers will use email to actually decipher if our campaigns are going out for customers, how many people are actually clicking on them from a clickbait perspective. Funny enough, ironic, clickbait can be a good thing and a bad thing as well. So in the same sense, at an email perspective, the whole idea for us is to actually build a picture for the steerco or for anyone who actually wants to get an understanding. If I'm being targeted, what do these threats actually look like? Where do they originate from? We always want to get a measure of protecting, but we never actually look at if these threats are originating internally as well. What does this data look like? Which takes us to another element, getting a specialist that will be able to translate this data for you. If I'm getting X amount of emails in a month, in a year, what does this information look like? If people are subscribing to third-party platforms or personal platforms like Takealot or anything of that sort, but using corporate email accounts, it's not shunned upon, but is it good business practice? And what are the repercussions for that? What have we seen from other organizations that have actually put up measures to actually either prevent or try and control that to a certain degree? So for us, I mean, for email is just literally one set of eye set that you can actually gain or get a visual perspective on, which is quite frankly the easiest one to gain control over. And from that perspective, it actually opens up a whole can of worms, and then you start to see exactly what other respective elements, to the last slide that you had from a ransomware, how to defend that. What other elements can you actually plug on top of that? As you mentioned, email is actually the easiest entry point or the first point of contact to try and protect the organization, basically.
Gary, you mentioned something rather interesting. I mean, I think everybody understands now that is a commodity, right? And I think you mentioned as well that a small organization could actually be targeted to gain information on attacking a large organization. We actually saw this last year with some of the big attacks that happened within South Africa, not necessarily the international ones, but even our own borders. You know, Jared, if I can maybe ask, one of the things, and maybe a technical concept, but we talk about whitelisting, right? So an organization that's dealing with a larger organization might be whitelisted, and that means that any email that comes from that small organization is trusted. Are there mechanisms in place that will kind of still check to see if an email that has been delivered on a whitelist is secure, or do these systems just completely ignore the security on these mails?
That's a good question, Richard. Are you referring to maybe Mimecast email security in general, or general security platforms?
Just in general, but let's use Mimecast as an example.
That's a good question. Yeah. So, I mean, typically, when you have a look at it from a whitelisting perspective, I think it's as crucial as possible. It's really crucial that we lock down that whitelist as much as we can. And what I mean by that is, if I am, as an example, permitting a domain, I'm permitting that domain, but for a specific set of security checks that I wanted to bypass, right? I'm not going to whitelist that for everything. So, I mean, we can use Mimecast as an example, but maybe just to elaborate more on what I'm saying. If we are, let's say, permitting an email sender or email domain, we want to bypass spam checks, IP reputation checks, and maybe grey listing checks, right? Doesn't mean that we're going to now be bypassing things like DNS authentication checks, where if somebody is sending an email from that particular domain, but maybe it's a spoofing attempt, as an example, right? It's very easy to send an email from any domain that you want to, if you have the relevant tools in place, and it's quick and easy to do that, right? So validating where that email came from and making sure that, okay, it says that it's this domain. Is it in fact this domain? Is it coming from the correct IP address? Is it stamped with the correct DKIM signature, as an example? And so I think that it's important when you're running one of those white lists that you being very specific to what you want to bypass. Is it flagging something currently, and how do we mitigate that while still maintaining a secure environment and not opening the floodgates, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, and you've touched on another point there, which is around DMARC protection, with the spoofing and DKIM records and stuff like that. Can you maybe just elaborate a little bit more for our users how a spoofing attack actually happens and how we can actually mitigate that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you get spoofing in all sort of shapes and sizes, and that could be spoofing of your users to your users. So somebody pretending to be Gary, sending me an email asking me to make a payment, whatever it might be. And that's from an inbound perspective, right? That really talks to securing your gateway, if I can call it that, your email perimeter to stop these threats coming through. But we're seeing past that, and to your point, from a DMARC perspective, where cyber criminals are not only targeting specific organizations, pretending to be them, but they'll pretend to be them and then go to that customer or that person's supply chain, their partners, their customers, things like that, and impersonate them as well. Right? So it becomes really important even from a DMARC perspective to secure that domain that you own, in that if anybody is sending emails on behalf of your domain, make sure that the internet understands that this, in fact, is not coming from you, if it's not, and put security controls or measures in place to protect that domain and get visibility of how your domain is also being utilized from a kind of Wild West, if I can call it that perspective, right? So out there on the internet, what we call the Wild Web, if somebody is impersonating your brand, you want that visibility in terms of the campaigns they might be sending out, how they're using your branding and your reputation that you've obviously spent decades building up, or years, or whatever it might be. So getting that visibility, but also that control. So if somebody is in fact spoofing your domain, how do we prevent that? And that's where the likes of DMARC, as an example, play a massive factor.
But if you look at today's environment, we mentioned already the fact that Mimecast would be doing its job, but you still want to be notified. And I think a lot of the customers that we have only pick up some of this information, kind of on the weekly or monthly reporting. But Gary, maybe from your perspective, what could customers be doing more to become proactive? Integrations. I know you guys have got a lot of out-of-the-box integrations into other tools, but could you maybe just explain what we could do to, number one, become more proactive when we pick up a threat, but also how you could build an entire ecosystem by integrating your email security and endpoint security together through APIs?
What's funny is we want to be proactive, but we don't want to be active with this situation. And that's what a lot of specialists are driving towards, because they want to start focusing on more important, call it mission critical elements. Not to say that threats are not mission critical. There's just more important things you just need to focus on. I don't know if you're able to actually share the last slide where you actually spoke to the ransomware. And I think that will help build a picture of exactly where that comes in. And this just explains exactly where not Mimecast is the OEM, but any security vendor that you would like to incorporate into your organization, and obviously incorporating that with a specialist like Armata to actually incorporate and manage this from the perspective. What you need to start seeing is a holistic approach of different endpoints. Mimecast is a specialist from an email security perspective as well. And this is where now, from a Mimecast perspective, we've actually looked at, and we know this for a fact, we're not the silver bullet. We do email security very great. But there are other, call it, elements. And cybersecurity is a defense or a community defense mechanism. And when I say community defense mechanism, this pillar just overarches a whole bunch of elements. Number one, from a human factor, I'll just use COVID, for example. There was a community defense mechanism. We wore masks and we're protecting ourselves. But at the same time, if you were sneezing, if you're coughing in public, you had to use your elbow. So there was a defense mechanism to actually protect the next person, social distancing. So in a similar fashion to what Jared spoke about now, where from a DMARC perspective, yes, you want to incorporate, firstly, at the email perspective, from a delivery perspective, you want to protect your internal staff members from threats coming into your organization in this case. But at the same time, regardless of whoever you are, whether you're Standard Bank or you're a massive financial institution or you are just a small artisanal entity as well, you still want to protect whoever you're doing business with, whether it be a customer, whether it be a supplier as well. In the same fashion, this DMARC principle that we speak of applies to each and every organization and person that sends emails and receives email as well. And so looking at this entire flow here, email security would say you want to stamp that as a Mimecast provider. That's where they come in. They do the whitelisting that Jared spoke of. They do the DMARC in what we call it validation as well. And by the way, all of these, call it technical checks or triggers that we're referring to as well, you'd want them to actively do their job without having you to lift your finger. And that's where the email security stack would need to do its job in this case, to identify if people are mimicking or imitating our internal staff members. What is it doing at an inbound perspective? But at the same time, we've also got viruses that are delivered on email. And then you've got the second part there where you look at endpoint security. You've got different specialists when it comes to endpoint security. You've got Kaspersky, you've got CrowdStrike, you've got ESET as well. And this is where now, because Mimecast, we process nearly 1 billion emails a day, you'd be surprised how many viruses we actually detect and reject at the gateway. So from an endpoint perspective or at an antivirus perspective, imagine you could actually get the ability to exchange virus signatures that have not been observed at a device level, due to the fact that there's not that much traffic that's exchanged at a device level as opposed to what you see on email. And for the fact why I say email is, going back to the defense mechanism as well, is you're not just relying on threats or call it data that's been obtained against information that's being sent to your respective organization. Defense mechanism, you need to pull all the threat intel that's coming from all organizations all over the world. So, at Mimecast, we've got about 40,000 customers. I was talking to someone right now, and I was like, generally, the purpose of why you would need to benefit, and why I'm telling you 40,000 customers. Hey, great, we've been around for 20 years, we've got 40,000 customers. That really doesn't mean anything to anyone that you speak to. But where it actually starts to make a difference is 40,000 customers, over 1 billion emails a day. What this means is all these threats that are being observed against all these organizations in a different fashion and forms. What that means is you get up-to-date, call it signatures that protect your organization, your end users in real time as well. Be able to exchange that with the rest of your ecosystem, the other tool sets that you've invested in from a monetary perspective as well. It's very difficult to go and check out technology that you've invested or used in the past 2 years or 5 years as well. How about now we start looking at how can we incorporate new tech that will now enhance our current technology, enhance it, automate whatever we can automate as well, which kicks into machine learning or artificial intelligence. At the end of the day, what you need to start doing is, because threats are very rapid, the threats are coming through in a tempestuous form as well, you'd need to have a similar form, call it a response as well, that'll be able to handle those types of threats coming into your organization. And that's just the basis point. You can go into a rabbit hole when it comes to integration from different technology.
So, Gary, just to get my mind straight then, are you saying that a solution like Mimecast could have an integration into another solution like CrowdStrike? Your sandbox could pick up there's a virus in an attachment that's not been seen before and actually share that information with CrowdStrike to go and do a search in the organization for a potential infection?
100%. So there are predisposed playbooks that can be put in play. Playbooks are like an automation book that actually instructs these two different tool sets to behave in a specific manner, look for specific type of elements that would be deemed as dangerous, and then call it outlay or actually create like a process flow to say, if something has been triggered as a bad virus that's been seen on email, please update our signatures. Ultimately, what you need to start seeing is you don't need the security specialist or the IT team running around having to run signatures manually every day. How about you actually get that automation to kick in and update those signatures as soon as something is flagged on the other side as well, which extends, from a network security, you've got other providers like Palo Alto as well. And then from a DLP perspective, which is nothing necessary to viruses, from a data leak prevention perspective, then you've got other providers like Netscope. You've got emails that are coming in and going out of the organization that contain probably keywords like bank or personal information. Because you've got so much traffic leaving your organization just at an email layer. And again, this email layer that we talk about is the organization's data trove. We already can tell from a marketing perspective, from any other element, from sending triggers, from sending statements to customers, that's like the lifeline of an organization. And imagine how much data you can use to enhance your business, call it performance. But in the same fashion, malicious actors are targeting that. So it is sadly like an overlooked element. But to your question, yes, you can incorporate an exchange of information between different OEM providers.
That's actually quite interesting because, traditionally people are using things like a SIEM and a SAW in the SOC, and the SAW is kind of their process automation, right? And I always like that use case where we say, hey, your EDR's picked up there's a ransomware. It then gets hold of the email security tool to create a rule to block that ransomware from coming in. And you're saying this could now be done via the API directly almost. And 100%. Then obviously, and that feedback and process flow would be absorbed by the SAW as well to then go to the network security device and kind of block it, or, depending where the API integrations are. That's really relevant information. And I think, again, maybe Jared, and let me throw one out at you so give you a little bit of airtime. But, one of the concepts in that is machine learning and AI. And the one is process rules driven, and the other one's kind of more an artificial intelligence. And we're seeing more and more of that in programs. Your EDRs are becoming more sort of artificially driven, with behavioral analytics and stuff like that. What are you guys doing from an email security perspective to kind of adapt and monitor using AI?
That's a good question, Richard. From a Mimecast perspective, one of the things that has been spoken about quite a lot, and one of the things that our customers are loving quite a bit is what we call cybergraph, and that's essentially using artificial intelligence and machine learning to help identify threats. It does that via understanding who your organization does business with, senders, recipients, the strength of those relationships, the proximity of those relationships, and that builds what we call an identity graph database that helps us identify any of those potential malicious emails or impersonation attacks and things like that. It's an interesting point that you bring up there, Richard. So, from a Mimecast perspective, because you did say Mimecast, yes, CyberGraph uses artificial intelligence, but we do have AI built in across the stack and over 10 different components, if I'm not mistaken. It's not to say, and I think everyone has probably heard the word AI, machine learning, I don't know, countless of times in the past few weeks. It's not necessarily always a silver bullet for everything. So I think when people hear AI, they get very excited. But one of my colleagues actually sent me a meme last week that I thought was quite accurate, which was it's a little green square, and it says, this is a dog. Artificial intelligence pick up a dog, and it's a little black Labrador with a Coke label and a bottle cap on his head wrapped around it. It's like a false positive there, basically. Not necessarily a silver bullet all the time, but it absolutely can be used to supplement a lot of what we do, and the security detection that we have and things like that, as well as the likes of automation and things like that you guys were referring to a little bit earlier.
It's difficult in our environment because, there was a focus on EDR, the endpoint protection using AI and machine learning rules, and people kind of forgot the old traditional signature-based, anti-malware, antivirus tools. And the guy started focusing on all of these behavioral analytics and stuff. And the next second, the common old, it's almost like the flu that goes around every year and still infects everyone, right? But organizations were hit by malware that's like 20 years old because the EDR was kind of looking, at changes in application behavior as opposed to a traditional lock your machine down type of malware. And I suppose from an email security perspective as well, you kind of still have to have both. You have to have that signature-based protection as well as that kind of behavioral understanding of how your email should be behaving. It does also then lead to, you think of an AI as somebody reading your mail and saying something's wrong with this, right? But from an awareness training, and Gary, I don't know if you want to maybe focus on this one, we're trying to train the user to almost be that kind of AI as well, right? How do we do awareness training? I mean, do we make them watch videos until they're bored to tears? What's the best way to do a user awareness campaign?
It's quite interesting that you say that. So the element that Jared just spoke about now, I mean, firstly, from a user awareness perspective as well, you can do that the traditional method, which is now traditional. The previously traditional method was get people into a room, watch a screen, and then do some form of an assessment afterwards. But the problem with that is you are not able to measure the performance, the knowledge aspect of people, even the aptitude or the sentiment, whether people really care about this exercise and you spending or taking 3 hours of their day and putting them into a room as well. So those methods nowadays, where you get a lot of platforms that automate the delivery of the content to the end user or employees via email, which is predominantly the most convenient form, which they can consume whenever, however, and then what the learning and development specialist in the organization, if you've got one, or if you've got an integrator, or if you've got a specialist that actually does that, maybe Amata does that, what you guys would need to see is you'd need to get like a consolidated report that shows you how many people have performed in a specific manner, how many people have actually participated in the phishing simulations or the learning campaigns that you've actually sent out. And at the same time, be able to actually automate these for the next upcoming months, and then come back to only get like a report in this case. And that's the more proactive element. But then there's another element where obviously the machine learning and the identity graph that Jared spoke about kicks in. This is now, again, because user awareness actually starts at the very beginning of the integration, or the interaction with technologies in the organization as well. And what I mean by that is at the first point, before you even send out any campaigns, you've got a new user into the organization. You firstly need to understand a whole bunch of aspects about this user before you dish out any form of awareness training. Yes, there'll be your stock standard induction type of IT policies that they need to be trained up on and then acknowledge. But then there's other elements just to teach them from basic parts of this is what the ramifications or the repercussions of falling victim for a cyber attack would look like. And also break down and say, this is what cyber attacks look like. It's not generally like a phishing email that you actually get. And those are the proactive elements that you use from a learning and development perspective. But then the machine learning that I speak of is at the point of contact, as soon as they get an email that's coming from a spoofing, impersonator outside of the organization as well. This is where the machine learning, the enabler, like crutches or like training wheels that steer or guide this person or this recipient to say, to your point, and Richard, you actually touched on it, it tells them, I don't think this email has ever been received by anyone in your organization. Simple context that just makes threats easy to understand. I don't need to know which IP address it's originating from China, and it's part of the, we'll call it RBL list. I don't even know what an RBL list, and end user won't know what that is. But if you can give basic context that says this email originated from someone new, no one in your organization has ever responded to this email. And again, these are banners that, number one, if you're in South Africa, we know traffic lights, sometimes we disregard them. If it's a banner that's in blue, that's in orange, that's in red, we get that color because it invokes some form of emotion to say, hold on, it's red. I'm not going to go ahead and actually do that. And then there's further to that, there's context. Don't respond to this email. And then at the same time, community defense mechanism. Afford the end user who's coming across this the ability to either report it or mark it as safe. In Jared's case, false positives. Say if something is actually incorrectly marked as dangerous, be able to actually send back that thread feedback to the gateway so that we don't have any more false positives, and then email flow can actually become more sufficient. And so those are the types of machine learning capabilities that you would like to incorporate into organization that would, number one, save you time, enable your end users, make them aware, and at the same day as well, automate most of the elements. You don't have to really go and get a Tesla all, but the whole idea is just getting something that's very basic for you to actually put in place and make it very proactive and easy to understand.
I think maybe to add to it as well, what's quite key is, user awareness training is an ongoing, and a lot of people is kind of, let's just do a once-off user awareness training. Okay, you've passed, done, right? But we see mails all the time, people coming out like, have you noticed now they're starting to use different characters? So, for example, my name's Richard, right? And they use a different Greek alphabet A to kind of do identity, fraud, to actually pretend like they're me, right? And I think the other issue that you have with user awareness training is a lot of organizations kind of use it as a way of beating their staff with a big stick. It's like, oh, you failed. And it's not that. It's more focusing, your efforts on the areas that actually require it. I don't want to go and say I would never fall victim to an attack because I'm, in cybersecurity. Even I could be caught up because I don't know everything that's out there these days. So this continuous learning cycle needs to happen. We need to make it positive and interactive with our staff. And I think, a lot of people get overwhelmed by boring videos. They kind of watch it for the sake of watching it, and then maybe write a little test at the end. And then the very next day they go and click on exactly what they were told not to click. So, keep it interesting, keep it updated, keep it relevant. I think that's the message that we really want to make sure from a user awareness as well. One of the things I wanted to ask you guys, and maybe raise your hands physically who want to fill this, but Amata is an MSP partner of Mimecast currently, and what that means is we do a lot more providing of services to our companies than maybe some other partners would do, some of our customers, sorry. What in your mind are the types of things that we as a cybersecurity organization could be doing as a value add to our customers in optimizing their email security? Because, putting Mimecast in, running it, or any other email security tool, just letting it go is not really the most relevant thing. It's a continuous optimizing of the solution, tweaking rules, making sure that your whitelist is still valid, looking at IP reputation scores and making sure that, some of those spam mails that you're getting are being reported. It's good defending, but you also want to kind of be a little bit more reactive on the back end of blacklisting some of those threats. What can a service provider do to assist from an email security perspective in optimizing that defense? Should we give Jared 5 and then I'll ask the same question to Gary? I think that's a good way to go.
With that.
Let's go,
Yeah.
Jared.
Yeah, Richard, I think in the beginning you kind of nailed it on the head there as well, just in terms of having services in place doesn't mean you kind of just necessarily always set and forget and you carry on with your day, and that's how it is. Having a look at the stats that you were pointing out a little bit earlier, threats are constantly evolving, right? So I think it's 8 out of 10 organizations, if I'm not mistaken, are seeing an increase in sophistication of attacks. We obviously seeing an increase in the number of attacks, but it's also the sophistication of those attacks that is obviously really crucial that we kind of pin down on and protect, right? That's the concerning part, the sophistication of the threat. So staying up to date, absolutely to your point, running regular audits of what security policies we might have in place. Are these still relevant? What bypasses do we have in place for the customer, as an example, from an MSP perspective, making sure that they're kind of the health of the security tools that we have in place are where they should be and aligned more to best practice. First part, I think knowledge sharing is a very important component of that as well. So having good well, you can say statistics like we're having a look at now, but general understanding of what is happening with the threat landscape, and then sharing that with the customer as well. Again, from a proactive perspective, understanding what threats are happening, what's evolving, how do we stay protected, how do we stay ahead of the game from that component is also massively crucial. Gary, I'm not sure if there's anything you'd add there.
Yeah, no, it's exactly what Jared said. So for me, it'll be, yeah, exactly making it. And then again, because organizations, if they don't have specialists, they really want to focus on what they want to do, which is run the business. If these elements could be simplified, I don't know if you've seen when you log into most banking apps, this is a specific one, F&B. When you log into their app, it actually gives you, if you want to check your balance or whatever you want to do on the app, before you actually go further into the login screen, they give you like 4 pointers or 4, what do you call it? What do you want to call them? It's like
Safety tips.
Yeah, it's like safety tips as well. And then Capitec, on the other hand, when you log in, they also give you an overview of how much you would have actually saved if you withdrew your money at a specific facility. So it's tips, and then it's hints, and it's insight that helps you perform much better, do better than what you did in the last month. Give you a benchmark, because you don't know what you don't know until you actually shown this is what you were, this is where you started, and this is where you can end up. So if organizations get context from a security standpoint, from an operational perspective. And another thing is, when we talk cybersecurity, is because it sounds like technology and it sounds like a grudge purchase. We spoke about budget earlier on. So how do we make this grudge purchase more, call it, valuable for us? We need to start getting insight. You didn't, and funny enough, even if you call it a grudge purchase, you spent money on something that is supposed to give you insight. So if organizations can get like very easy to understand insight, obviously this is where the translation of the data comes into play. Be able to translate this data so that you can understand that what is the return on investment of what I've actually put into my organization? How is it supposed to benefit me? Yes, it's protecting me, but operationally, what does this mean for me? And then building a bigger picture to say, from a brand perspective as well, how does this affect your brand? How do the other organizations or stakeholders that you work with, how do they view you if you do not have these type of mitigation policies or strategies in place? So it's more of enabling the organization and the specialists, if they've got any, easy to understand, get them from point A to point B using the technologies that they've got. And also, to Jared's point, optimizing it where possible so that it can actually give them the benefit.
Yeah, and I think, it's quite interesting as well, even from us as an MSP partner of yours, we've noticed that the skills that are required from, supporting are quite extensive. You almost need someone who's proficient on both the email side as well as the email security side. You need to understand, where's the problem actually sitting? Is it on the actual email platform itself, or is it on the email security platform? Makes it very difficult. And I don't believe many users, have that kind of skill level within the organization. Even IT providers, we've spoken to a couple of IT providers that don't have cybersecurity skills, and they struggle with the understanding of the email security component. So it's always great to partner with someone that's got that skill in both. It does raise an interesting question as well. Somebody gave me an answer to this question the other day in quite an interesting way, but I'd love to hear from you guys what your thoughts are. Gary, maybe you can field this one. Why is it that you have all of these platforms like Microsoft Exchange Online, you've got your Gmail accounts with Google, and there's a whole lot of different varying platforms. Why is it relevant that we still have a third-party email security tool protecting us? Why is their solution not good enough? And I don't want to throw any vendors under the bus and say, because you've got weak security or something, but it's like, there's more to the email security aspect of it than just what those providers are able to provide. And can you maybe just elaborate a bit on that, Gary?
So firstly, everyone who I talk to says us consolidating was a great idea, but sadly we are still seeing some elements that we thought we would never see because we were promised 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And again, it's not because it doesn't perform adequately. So we run, just to give you some context as to why we actually think what they're telling us is actually true. So again, processing 1 billion emails a day, it's not a waste. It's not just a river of data flowing in and out of the organization. For Mimecast, what this means is this provides us with great threat telemetry And what we're able to obtain is, out of all the organizations that are subscribed to Mimecast, and out of all the organizations that are not on Mimecast, that are emailing our organizations that are on Mimecast, what does this data or this data flow looks like? So when you look at this data lake now, we've got a monthly intel summary that we conduct every month. And what that intel threat summary actually gives us context on, number one, the email volume that we've observed, let's say in a benchmark of between January up to the latest month. And then we get a benchmark of how many threats did we see in the last month compared to this month. And then out of that total volume of emails, what are the different types of techniques that we use? Different types of techniques I refer to would be impersonation, spam, opportunistic emails, virus delivery. There's another one, phishing attempts as well. And what's funny is from the May report, impersonation and spam and opportunistic attacks were the top ranking methods of delivery. And then moving over, you start to look at what are the most, what are the common platforms that have been used? And you get three. You get other, which can be anything, could be an IMAP platform or a shared hosting platform. And then you get G Suite, which is the second ranking one. And then M365 was the top targeted one in this case. And based on this information, then you start to tell it with what you're hearing out in the market. And you're like, customers are saying they're being targeted a lot. We're seeing it on our side as well. So it's not a matter of one is better than the other, to be honest with you, Richard. What you start looking at now is you need to start looking at the market, element as well. A specific platform is getting a massive market share. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a benefit for you guys who are going to be subscribing to this platform as a business. It also means it's a great target for malicious actors that will now go and subscribe on the same platform and use any form of technique to evade those forms of detections in the native platform itself. It's like literally inviting a criminal into your estate. So in this case, this is where you now start looking at, other elements to protect you. Yes, you may not have a response or a security response team like ADT if you live in an estate, but you start looking at other security measures. You start looking at, I need to have house insurance. I need to start having cameras or beams or something of that sort that actually just lets you know that if someone has actually gained access to my property, this is what I can actually see when it actually happened, and then look at other methods as well. So and there are different platforms that are great at specific elements, but it's eggs in one basket, going back to that old say that we used to say, it's not actually having everything in there. You'd need to have a different set of eyes. And that's why different OEM providers are not even just relying on their own technology. They're even opening up their platforms to integrate and exchange information with other platforms. That in its own just needs to translate to say that this is becoming a wide reach problem, and it's not just one sole provider that can eliminate all the issues that you may be experiencing or maybe in the future.
Yeah, and I mean, some of those points that you raised are quite interesting as well. And I think one of the things that we've noticed in the last couple of years from an email security perspective is, these trends are growing. And just give me 1 second, please. Joys of working from home when your son decides to join you from school. Apologies.
That's another level of awareness training, distraction.
Apologies. Yeah. So where I was going to is, the information sharing among some of these incidents that we've picked up. We've seen a lot of accounts hijacking and the need for multi-factor authentication. I think that's now growing. We've seen a lot of impersonation attacks as well. That kind of rise, and we've been sharing that information with our customers. Somebody was saying the other day, it's like an organization that's kind of doing billions a year in revenue doesn't really notice a 250K impersonation attack where they've paid an invoice incorrectly. Someone in a small organization of 10 users would possibly notice that more. And I think this is why email security is kind of relevant to everybody out there. The cost, though, of some of these solutions can become prohibitive. And it is great to see that we are kind of more on a kind of a user account based and being able to tailor the solutions to an organization's requirements. I mean, Jared, from an industry perspective, just as a closing statement, do you normally advise customers in specific verticals on email security that's kind of more relevant, like with legal? I mean, there's an aspect of archiving as well that's kind of a requirement, and you'd probably need to throw an archiving solution in to legal to keep records of the emails. Are verticals a factor in providing an email security solution? I think that's the question.
Sorry, Richard, if you could repeat the last part of that question. I got everything else.
So I was just saying now, does a specific vertical influence a decision on the email security solution that's relevant to the organization? For example, medical and legal might have some different aspects to retail.
Good question. I think from an email security perspective, not always entirely. I think when you have a look at things like data leakage prevention, as an example, that could be a lot more relevant to the likes of financial institutions or maybe healthcare organizations where you don't want client data or things. I mean, DLP is important to everyone, but when you look at the nuances and the differences in the tool sets, I think that's where it could vary based on verticals. I think email security is important for everyone, regardless of the size of your organization, typically the vertical of your organization as well. I mean, even if we're having a look at sizes of organizations, if I'm not mistaken, customer or organizations to the size of, I think, about 5,000 users, about 70% of those have been negatively impacted with ransomware. As soon as you step up to like 10,000 to 50,000, things like that, it drops to about 40%, still staggering numbers. But I think it still shows that regardless of the size of your organization or the vertical that you play in, it's email security is very relevant to everyone. And I think email does, maybe just off the back of the last question, deserve a bit more, right? So 91, depending on who's reporting on the stats, between 91 and 94% of cyber threats still use email as an attack vector. So again, that's talking holistically to all organizations. I mean, unless you guys are not using email at all, just great.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think you answered exactly what I was hoping for. And, email security is relevant. I think cybersecurity is relevant. And as my one twin just showed, I should have locked my door to my office before we had this call. It's simple things that we kind of fail on. Gents, I think we are running out of time. I don't know if there's any closing points that anybody would like to make, but I'd just like to thank you guys again for joining us today, and for all our guests that made the time and effort to join us. It's been great, as always, gents, to chat with you, and audience, I hope you had some key takeaways and learned something today. If there are any questions, or if anybody would like to get a copy of the recording, we will paste it to the Omata website later. But you are also welcome to email us at sales@omata.co.za, or to myself directly. For those of you who know me, Richard Frost, any questions or any follow-up sessions, and I can direct you to Gary and Jared if there's any questions for them. But once again, guys, thanks very much, and have a great day further.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.